The year 1816 has an official name. The year without a summer. Snow in June, frost in July, crops blackened in the fields across New England, across Europe, across the entire Northern Hemisphere, famine so severe that governments collapsed under the weight of it, bread riots in France, mass starvation in Ireland, a cold so wrong, so out of season, so absolute that people genuinely believed the sun was dying. Ask any historian what caused it, and you'll get the same answer delivered with the same confidence. Mount Tambora. A volcanic eruption in April 1815 on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history, so massive, we're told, that it threw enough ash and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere to lower global temperatures for over a year. Natural, documented, settled science. For most of my life I accepted that without question. Then I started looking at the evidence, not just the climate data, everything, the demographic records, the architectural timeline, the institutional response, the orphan histories, the population movements, the maps. And the deeper I went, the more the Tambora explanation began to feel like exactly what a cover story is supposed to feel like. Sufficient, plausible, just detailed enough to satisfy, just authoritative enough to end questions. Because here's what the official explanation asks us to accept. A single volcano caused climate disruption, severe enough to require the creation of entirely new social institutions across multiple continents, the systematic relocation of hundreds of thousands of people, the construction of thousands of buildings with features that make no sense as famine response, the erasure of population records on an industrial scale, and a coordinated global institutional response that would have been logistically impossible given the communication infrastructure of 1816. All of that from one volcano. Once you see the gap between the stated cause and the documented response, you cannot unsee it. And once you start asking what kind of event would actually require a response of this scale, only one answer fits all the evidence. This is the story of 1816, not the version you were taught, the version the evidence actually supports. Part 1, what the climate record actually shows. Let's start with the data, because if the Tambora explanation is correct, the climate record should be consistent with known volcanic cooling patterns, and in some ways it is. Global temperatures did drop in 1816, that is documented, measured, real. The sulfur dioxide injection from Tambora into the stratosphere created aerosols that reflected solar radiation. We understand this mechanism, we have modeled it. We have observed it in smaller eruptions since. But here's what the models don't explain. The cooling in 1816 was not uniform, not even close. Volcanic cooling distributes according to atmospheric circulation patterns. It spreads gradually from the eruption site, follows stratospheric wind patterns, produces widespread but relatively even temperature depression across latitude bands. The 1816 record doesn't show this. What it shows is localized severity at a granular level that volcanic aerosol distribution cannot produce. Some regions experienced catastrophic cold. Adjacent regions were barely affected. The variation is too sharp, too localized, too inconsistent with how stratospheric aerosols actually behave. Furthermore, the onset was too fast. Tambora erupted in April 1815. The atmospheric transit time for sulfur dioxide aerosols to reach global distribution is measured in months. The worst effects of 1816 began appearing in records in early spring of that year, which is consistent with a roughly 12-month lag. But regional climate disruptions, unusual cold, aberrant precipitation patterns, begin showing up in records from late 1815, earlier than the volcanic model comfortably predicts. And the recovery pattern is wrong. After the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo, one of the most closely studied major volcanic events in history, global temperatures dropped by approximately 0.5 degrees Celsius and recovered over roughly 2 years following predictable atmospheric dispersion curves. The recovery was gradual and relatively smooth. The 1816 recovery was not smooth. Some regions bounced back quickly, others experienced lingering disruption for years. The temperature record in the years immediately following 1816 shows irregularities that atmospheric scientists have acknowledged, in careful language in peer-reviewed papers, are not fully explained by the Tambora model alone. The official response to this is to propose additional contributing factors, other smaller volcanic events, natural climate variability, solar minimum conditions. In other words, Tambora alone doesn't explain it, so we add other natural causes until the explanation fits. But that's not how science is supposed to work. You don't start with a conclusion and add variables until the math works. You follow the evidence to the explanation it actually supports. When you do that honestly, the 1816 climate record is consistent with something that produced rapid, irregular, geographically clustered atmospheric disruption. Something that injected massive quantities of particulate matter into the atmosphere in multiple locations simultaneously. Something that created localized zones of severe environmental damage, surrounded by regions of lesser impact. That is not the signature of a single distant volcano. That is the signature of something closer, something multiple, something distributed. Part 2, the Orphan problem. Here is where the investigation pivots from climate science to human history. Because if 1816 was truly a volcanic winter, the human response should look like a response to a volcanic winter: temporary food assistance, agricultural adjustment, some migration away from the worst affected regions, gradual recovery as the climate normalized. That is not what happened. What happened instead was the systematic, institutionally coordinated, decades-long relocation of children. The orphan train movement, formally beginning in 1853, but drawing on institutional frameworks established in the decades immediately following 1816, relocated over 200,000 children from Eastern American cities to rural areas across the continent. 200,000 children, systematically removed from urban centers, placed with families in the interior. Transporting in organized waves by coordinated institutions operating under the stated mission of addressing urban poverty and overcrowding. The official explanation is that industrialization created poverty, poverty created orphans, and charitable institutions responded. But the timeline doesn't work. If the orphan crisis was caused by industrialization and urban poverty, the response should have grown gradually alongside industrialization. It should have been concentrated in the most industrialized cities and varied regionally based on local economic conditions. The children should have documented family histories, birth records, institutional intake records, the kind of paperwork that 19th century charity organizations were fastidious about maintaining. None of this fits the actual record. The orphan train programs show institutional coordination that preceded the scale of the problem they were supposedly addressing. The infrastructure, the railways, the placement networks, the receiving families, was organized before the volume of children requiring placement was documented. Organizations were building capacity for a flood before the flood was officially acknowledged. And the records. The records are wrong in a way that poverty and urban dislocation doesn't explain. Children arrive at placement organizations with no documented family history, not incomplete histories, not records damaged by fire or flood, no history, the family terminates. The child exists from a certain point forward with no documented origin. For hundreds, for thousands of the children in these programs, the question of where they came from has no answer in the official archive. Poverty doesn't erase family records. Poverty leaves traces. Poverty generates workhouse intake forms and parish relief records and death certificates and hospital admissions. The Victorian era, for all its brutality toward the poor, was meticulous about documenting the poor. The poor were a bureaucratic category. They were counted, classified, and recorded with institutional thoroughness. The orphan-trained children whose records terminate abruptly were not erased by poverty. They were erased by something else. Something that destroyed not just their families, but the documentary context in which their families existed. Something that removed not just the people but the paper trail. Something that required, or at least produced, a clean break between a before and an after, with the children stranded on the afterside of a line that official history pretends doesn't exist. What event produces that kind of erasure? Not a volcanic winter. A volcanic winter leaves survivors who remember. It leaves communities intact enough to document their losses. It leaves the living to bury and record the dead. What produces mass orphaning without documentation is the destruction of the community itself, not the deaths of individual parents, the annihilation of the environment in which those families existed, the rendering of entire regions uninhabitable, the elimination not just of people, but of the physical and institutional context in which those people's lives were recorded. 200,000 children with no before. That is not the aftermath of a cold year. Part 3, the buildings that shouldn't exist. Now look at what got built in the years following 1816. Because here is where the architectural record, becomes impossible to explain within the official narrative. A genuine response to a volcanic winter and subsequent famine would produce a specific kind of construction: emergency granaries, agricultural infrastructure, temporary shelters, structures built quickly, built cheaply, built to address the immediate crisis of food scarcity and displaced agricultural workers. That is not what was built. What was built was a massive, continent-spanning network of institutional structures: orphanages, asylums, reformatories, workhouses, foundling hospitals, institutions of a scale and permanence and architectural sophistication that makes no sense as emergency response to an 18-month climate disruption. These were not temporary shelters. They were engineered structures, reinforced foundations going deeper than load-bearing requirements demanded, standardized layouts repeated across geographically distant locations with an architectural uniformity that suggests central planning rather than independent regional response. Capacity designed for populations far larger than the stated number of displaced persons requiring assistance. And the features. This is the detail that kept pulling me back. Many of these post-1816 institutional buildings incorporate design elements that are simply inexplicable as responses to famine: specialized ventilation systems, thickened exterior walls beyond what the climate required for heating efficiency, sealed lower levels, structural configurations that suggest the buildings were designed to maintain a controlled interior environment against external atmospheric conditions, not just cold, but something in the air itself. These buildings were not designed to house people displaced by crop failure. They were designed to protect people from an environment that remained dangerous. Think about what that means. An 18-month volcanic winter doesn't require buildings engineered for atmospheric protection. By the time you've designed, sourced materials for, and constructed a major institutional building, a volcanic winter is over. You don't engineer for ongoing atmospheric threat unless the atmospheric threat is ongoing. Unless what happened in 1816 left regions that remained contaminated, zones that couldn't be safely reoccupied, areas where the air, the water, the soil itself retained something that required inhabitants to be housed in sealed, ventilated, controlled environments. What environmental contamination persists for years or decades after a volcanic eruption? None that requires architectural response. What environmental contamination persists for years or decades after nuclear or similarly catastrophic industrial destruction? Exactly the kind that would require the buildings we see being constructed across the post-1816 landscape. And here's what seals it for me. The construction happened simultaneously, across America, across Britain, across continental Europe, across Russia. The same institutional building types, the same architectural features, the same capacity planning, appearing within the same compressed timeframe across regions that officially had no coordinated communication infrastructure capable of synchronizing a construction program of this scale. Independent regional responses to a shared crisis don't look like this. They look chaotic, varied, experimental. Different institutions trying different solutions. Architectural diversity reflecting local materials and local conditions. What we see instead is uniformity. Deliberate, precise, continental uniformity. That's not independent response. That's coordinated execution of a pre-existing plan. Part 4, the coordination that couldn't exist. This is the argument I find most difficult to dismiss and most difficult to explain within the official framework. In 1816, the fastest communication between continents was a ship. The telegraph wouldn't be commercially deployed for another 30 years. International institutional coordination was limited to diplomatic correspondence that took weeks or months to transit between capitals. The idea that governments and charitable organizations across America, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and the rest of Europe independently developed identical responses to the same climate disaster, implemented them simultaneously, built structurally similar institutions to identical capacity specifications, and managed population redistribution on a scale that required logistical coordination far beyond the stated infrastructure, is not a plausible description of how isolated regional institutions actually behave. Isolated regional institutions don't produce uniform outcomes. They produce variation. They produce experimentation. They produce the messy, contradictory, architecturally diverse record of people trying to solve problems they've never encountered before with tools they're inventing as they go. The post-1816 institutional record doesn't look like that. It looks like the implementation of a standardized protocol, like organizations working from the same playbook, like a response that was coordinated before the crisis it was supposedly responding to. Which means one of two things. Either the coordinating infrastructure existed before 1816 and was simply not visible to the official historical record, meaning the communication networks, the institutional frameworks, the centralized planning capacity, were already in place as components of the pre-1816 world. The world that, if we follow the Tartaria hypothesis, may have been far more globally integrated than official history acknowledges. Or the response wasn't to the 1816 event at all, it was prepared in anticipation of it, which would mean that whoever coordinated the institutional response knew what was coming, knew the scale, knew the duration of the environmental hazard, knew how many people would need to be housed and protected and relocated, and why their records would need to be managed. Both possibilities point in the same direction. The 1816 catastrophe was not a surprise. It was managed, from the beginning, by people or institutions with foreknowledge of its scale and a prepared infrastructure for its aftermath. A volcanic eruption is not managed. It is responded to, imperfectly, chaotically, regionally, with whatever resources happen to be available. What gets managed, in the sense of prepared for, anticipated, and administratively contained, is a known risk, an anticipated event, the kind of catastrophe that comes with warning, or that is itself the deliberate result of something that was known to be possible. Part 5, Tartaria and the technology question. Here is where the two threads converge, because the 1816 catastrophe doesn't exist in isolation, it sits in a specific historical context, and that context, if you follow the evidence honestly, looks nothing like what official history describes. Look at the pre-1816 world through its physical remnants rather than its written history, the buildings, the infrastructure, the engineering. What you find is a world that was considerably more technically sophisticated than the official narrative of early 19th century civilization acknowledges. Acoustic engineering in structures officially attributed to colonial-era builders who had no formal knowledge of acoustic science. Precise astronomical alignments in civic buildings, supposedly erected by frontier laborers working from rough plans. Load-bearing systems engineered to tolerances that exceed functional necessity, suggesting knowledge of structural forces that wasn't formally codified until later in the century. Heating and ventilation systems, in some cases, that demonstrate understanding of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics that official history places in a later period. These aren't anomalies in a single region. They're distributed across the pre-1816 architectural record globally. Official history explains this as the intuitive genius of skilled craftsmen, as happy accidents of trial and error, as inherited classical knowledge imperfectly understood but successfully applied. But intuitive genius doesn't produce global uniformity. Trial and error doesn't produce precision engineering across disconnected cultures. Imperfect understanding doesn't generate buildings that still stand, acoustically perfect and structurally sound, 2 centuries later. What produces this is a knowledge base, a shared, codified, transmitted body of technical understanding applied consistently by people trained in its application. The buildings of the pre-1816 period were not built by people guessing well. They were built by people who knew exactly what they were doing, who had been trained in a tradition of knowledge sophisticated enough to produce what we can measure and study in the physical remains. And then 1816 happened. And the knowledge fractured. Look at what comes after. The decades immediately following 1816 show a peculiar pattern in the technical record. Capabilities that appear in fragments in the pre-1816 world have to be laboriously redeveloped, metallurgical techniques reinvented, construction methods rediscovered, scientific principles reformulated from scratch by researchers who appear to have no knowledge that these principles had already been understood. That's not progress continuing after a setback. That's reconstruction after catastrophic loss. The difference matters. Progress builds on what came before, even imperfectly. It cites predecessors. It refines existing techniques. It shows continuity even through disruption. Reconstruction starts over. It has no predecessors to cite because the predecessors were destroyed along with their records. It doesn't refine because there's nothing left to refine from. It reinvents because the original invention is gone. The post-1816 technical record looks like reconstruction. Specifically, it looks like reconstruction following the kind of event that destroys not just people and buildings, but the institutional memory in which technical knowledge is stored and transmitted. Libraries, universities, professional guilds, the physical and human infrastructure through which a civilization's knowledge base is maintained across generations. What destroys all of that simultaneously, across multiple continents, within a narrow timeframe? Not a volcanic winter. Part 6, the nuclear hypothesis. I want to be precise about what I'm proposing and what I'm not. I am not claiming that 1816 was caused by a nuclear exchange in the modern sense. I am not describing mushroom clouds over European capitals or intercontinental ballistic missiles. I am not projecting 20th century weapons technology onto the early 19th century. What I am proposing is this. The pre-1816 world, the world that appears on maps as Tartaria, the world whose architectural remnants display technical sophistication beyond its official capabilities, may have possessed energy and weapons technology that we do not account for in our official understanding of that period. Not science fiction technology, not anachronistic fantasy, technology consistent with the level of scientific understanding that the architectural and engineering record suggests they actually possessed, which was, by the evidence, considerably more advanced than official history credits. The destruction of a civilization possessing advanced energy and weapons technology would produce a specific atmospheric signature: rapid, irregular temperature drops, localized zones of severe environmental contamination, multiple simultaneous atmospheric disturbance events rather than the single-point dispersal of a volcanic eruption, particulate matter distributed according to destruction patterns rather than atmospheric circulation patterns. That is the signature of the 1816 climate record. Furthermore, the aftermath management requirements of a nuclear-scale catastrophe match the institutional response we document following 1816 far better than famine response does. Mass population relocation away from contaminated zones, institutional housing with environmental protection features for populations who cannot return to their home regions, systematic management of survivors who have knowledge of what actually happened and whose testimony requires containing, erasure of records from affected areas, construction of new institutional frameworks for a population that has lost its previous social structure entirely. The orphan trains are not moving children displaced by crop failure. They are moving survivors of communities that no longer exist, children whose families, whose homes, whose entire regional context was destroyed, not temporarily disrupted, destroyed, rendered uninhabitable for years or decades, removed from the map in a way that required not just physical reconstruction, but the construction of an entirely new historical narrative to explain what was no longer there. Families don't disappear from records because of a cold year. Families disappear from records because the environment that recorded them is gone. Part 7, the silence in the archive. The question I keep returning to is this: where is the contemporary questioning? A volcanic eruption causes climate disruption that triggers the systematic relocation of hundreds of thousands of people, the construction of continent-spanning institutional infrastructure, decades of orphan redistribution, and population movements on a scale that reorganizes entire regions, and no one at the time asked whether the response matched the cause. No parliamentary debate about why famine response required fortified institutional buildings. No journalistic investigation into why so many children had no documented family history. No academic paper questioning why the institutional coordination exceeded the stated communication capacity of the period. The silence is complete, and deliberate silence on that scale requires effort. Ordinary events generate questioning. Ordinary disasters produce survivors who dispute the official account, who notice when the response doesn't fit the stated cause, who ask uncomfortable questions in public forums. The chaotic, uncontrollable, decentralized nature of public discourse means that implausible official explanations get challenged, unless the challenging mechanism itself is controlled. The press of the early 19th century was not free in the modern sense. It was concentrated, institutionally connected, and dependent on the goodwill of the very governments and institutions that would have been managing the 1816 response. The academic establishment was similarly concentrated and similarly dependent. Controlling the narrative of 1816, ensuring that the volcanic explanation was adopted universally and questioned nowhere, would have required exactly the kind of centralized institutional control over public information that the pre-existing coordination infrastructure, the same infrastructure that managed the institutional response, would have been capable of exercising. The silence isn't evidence of nothing happening. The silence is evidence of something happening that was successfully managed. And successful management of information on that scale, in 1816, with the communication constraints of that period, required either that the managing institutions were already globally coordinated, which points to the pre-existing Tartarian infrastructure, or that the event was anticipated and the information management prepared in advance. Either way, you're not looking at natural disaster response. You're looking at crisis management by an entity with global reach and decades of operational capacity. Part 8. The maps that changed. If 1816 marked the destruction or collapse of Tartaria, the map record should show it. And it does. The cartographic transition that begins in the 1780s, with Tartaria starting to fade from European maps, accelerates dramatically in the decade following 1816. By the 1820s, the territories once labeled Tartary on every major European atlas are being divided and relabeled with the confident specificity of powers that have recently acquired, surveyed, and formally claimed them. Russian imperial expansion eastward reaches new speed in this period. The official explanation is military and diplomatic consolidation of territories that had been loosely administered. But the rate of the expansion, and the confident cartographic precision with which newly acquired territories are immediately surveyed and labeled, suggests not the slow administrative absorption of contested frontier land, but the rapid claiming of territory from which its previous occupants have recently and abruptly departed. You don't survey and map a wilderness with that speed and precision. You survey and map territory that already has infrastructure, roads already laid, cities already located, foundations already placed. The surveyor's job, when the civilization that built the infrastructure is gone, is not to discover the landscape but to measure and record what's already there and attribute it to the new owner. The post-1816 cartographic record of Central Asia and Siberia reads like exactly that. A rapid, confident, precise accounting of inherited geography, not exploration, inventory. And the dating of the transition matters enormously. If Tartaria was already fading from maps before 1816, and it was, with the erasure beginning in the 1780s, then the 1816 event was not the beginning of Tartaria's end. It was the end. The dark day of 1780 may have been, as I've argued elsewhere, the atmospheric signature of a civilization beginning to collapse. The cluster of atmospheric events of the 1780s and 1790s may represent the early stages of a catastrophe unfolding over decades. And 1816 may have been the final chapter, the last act, the event that completed what the 1780s began, that destroyed what had survived the first catastrophe, that cleared the map entirely, left the ruins empty and the survivors scattered, and created the conditions for the coordinated inheritance that we see reflected in the post-1816 institutional and cartographic record. 2 catastrophes, 1 civilization, 30 years of collapse and erasure. And a volcanic eruption to explain the smoke. Part 9. What was lost? This is the part that disturbs me most deeply, not the political question of who knew and who covered it up, not the institutional question of how the coordination was managed, the human question, the knowledge question. What did we lose? Because if the pre-1816 world possessed the technical sophistication that its architectural remnants suggest, then what disappeared in the catastrophe was not just a civilization in the geopolitical sense. What disappeared was a body of knowledge, accumulated over generations, representing humanity's actual understanding of the physical world at that point in history. And it was more advanced than we've been told. The acoustic engineering, the structural mathematics, the astronomical alignment, the material science visible in the stone, in the mortar, in the proportioning systems of the great buildings that survived. These are not the products of a civilization at the technological level official history assigns to the early 19th century. These are the products of a civilization that understood more than we do now about certain domains of knowledge, about how sound moves through space, about how structures interact with the forces acting on them, about how to work stone to tolerances that modern machinery struggles to replicate. That knowledge is gone. Not lost in the library fire sense, where the books burn but the principles survive in the minds of the practitioners and are eventually rewritten. Gone in the sense that the practitioners themselves were gone, that the institutional transmission of the knowledge, the guild structures, the teaching lineages, the living chain of master to apprentice through which technical knowledge actually survives civilizational disruption, was severed. What we have instead is the physical evidence, the buildings, the infrastructure, the remnants of a technical vocabulary encoded in stone that we can measure and photograph and wonder at but cannot fully read because we've lost the language. The post-1816 world had to reconstruct it from scratch. And the reconstruction is visibly incomplete. The Victorian-era buildings that official history presents as the triumphant products of industrial progress are technically inferior to the buildings they supposedly superseded. The acoustics are worse. The proportioning is less precise. The structural elegance is absent. They are bigger, faster, cheaper, and built to lower standards than what came before. That's not what progress looks like. Progress improves on its predecessors. What we see after 1816 is a civilization working harder to achieve less, inventing new industrial methods to approximate, imperfectly, what older methods had achieved with what now looks, from the physical evidence, like greater mastery. That's what the aftermath of civilizational collapse looks like. That's what recovery from catastrophic knowledge loss looks like. And the orphan trains, seen in this light, become something even darker than mass relocation. They become the systematic separation of survivors from each other, the dissolution of communities that might have preserved fragments of the lost knowledge, the institutional containment of people who remembered, or whose parents remembered, or whose grandparents had lived in, the world before. Scatter the survivors, erase their records, raise their children in new communities with new identities and no connection to what came before. 200,000 children, no documented origins, raised to not know what they came from. That's not poverty management. That's memory erasure at industrial scale. Part 10, what I can prove and what I can't. Let me be direct with you about where the evidence is solid and where I'm asking you to follow inference rather than fact. What I can prove from documented, accessible, verifiable records is this. The 1816 climate data is inconsistent with purely volcanic causation in ways that atmospheric scientists have themselves acknowledged. The institutional response to 1816 is coordinated at a level that exceeds the stated communication and organizational infrastructure of the period. The orphan train movement produced hundreds of thousands of children with no documented family history in ways that poverty and urban dislocation do not explain. The post-1816 construction program shows architectural uniformity and features inconsistent with emergency famine response. The cartographic record shows accelerated erasure of Tartarian designations in the decades immediately following 1816. These are not interpretations. These are documented patterns that the official narrative does not adequately explain. What I cannot prove is the mechanism. I cannot definitively demonstrate that Tartaria possessed advanced weapons technology. I cannot prove that a nuclear-scale exchange or industrial catastrophe caused the atmospheric disruption of 1816. I cannot prove the coordination of the institutional response was deliberate management rather than extraordinary coincidence. What I can say is that the evidence fits one explanation and strains another. The volcanic explanation requires coincidence after coincidence. Atmospheric data that happens to be inconsistent with volcanic models, but is attributed to additional unspecified natural variability. Institutional coordination that happens to exceed the stated infrastructure, but is attributed to the shared human instinct for organized charity. Records that happen to be missing for exactly the populations most directly affected. Buildings that happen to have environmental protection features, despite being designed for temporary famine response. The alternative explanation, that 1816 marked the catastrophic destruction of a sophisticated pre-existing civilization by means that left persistent environmental contamination and required coordinated management of the surviving population, requires no coincidences. Every anomaly in the official record becomes consistent, predictable evidence. The atmospheric irregularity, the institutional coordination, the missing records, the architectural features, the orphan demographics, the cartographic acceleration. One explanation requires constant coincidence. The other explanation requires accepting that something large was hidden behind something smaller. I know which one I find more intellectually honest. Coda, the year that ended the world before. The year without summer. Snow in June, frost in August. A cold so wrong that the Swiss were reduced to eating cats and rats and the bark of trees. A cold so absolute that it produced the demographic data we don't look at and the institutional response we don't question and the orphan records we don't investigate. Tambora, we're told, just Tambora. A mountain in Indonesia that no one in New England had ever heard of, erupting the previous year, whose ash somehow darkened skis and cooled temperatures with a specificity and irregularity and geographic clustering that volcanic aerosols cannot actually produce. I started this investigation looking for an explanation for the year without a summer. What I found was a window into a world that existed before 1816 that was not the world official history describes, a world with infrastructure we can still measure, knowledge we can still study in the physical remnants. A technical sophistication encoded in stone that tells a story the written record no longer contains. And I found the evidence of how that world ended. Not gradually, not through the slow decline and economic displacement and cultural evolution that civilizations usually die of, abruptly, completely, with enough force to leave an atmospheric signature visible across the Northern Hemisphere and enough contamination to require decades of institutional management of the surviving population. And then I found the cover. A volcano, far away, conveniently the largest eruption in recorded history, large enough to plausibly claim credit for everything, recent enough to be recent cause for contemporary effects, distant enough that no one who lived through the year without a summer could travel there to investigate. The perfect explanation, sufficient, plausible, geographically inaccessible, and scientifically complex enough that challenging it requires expertise most people don't have. Behind that explanation, 200,000 children with no past, thousands of buildings with features no famine response requires, cartographic erasure accelerating precisely when the last remnants of what those maps had named were being cleared and claimed, a knowledge tradition shattered so completely that the civilization which inherited the physical remnants spent generations trying to reconstruct principles the original builders had long since mastered. What was lost in 1816 wasn't a cold year's harvest. What was lost was a world. The buildings are still there, the Orphan records or their absence are still there, the climate data is still there, the maps, the before and the after are still there. The evidence is everywhere, it always has been. It just requires asking the question that official history has spent 2 centuries making uncomfortable. What actually happened in 1816? Not the volcanic story, not the tidy natural disaster, the real thing. The thing that required orphan trains and institutional fortresses, and accelerated cartographic erasure, and the deliberate management of a population that couldn't be allowed to know what it had survived. What ended in 1816 was not just a cold summer. What ended was a civilization. And what was built in its place, the institutions, the redrawn maps, the official histories, was designed from the beginning to make sure we would never know what came before. The year without summer, snow in June, children on trains with no names and no past. And a volcano, conveniently, to explain it all. If any of this resonates, if you found the gaps in the official record, if you've stood in one of those post-1816 institutions and felt the wrongness of a building engineered beyond its stated purpose, leave a comment. Share what you found. Because the investigation doesn't end with 1816, it starts there. The world before that year is still speaking. In stone, in absence, in the records that were kept, and the records that were erased, and the children who arrived on trains from nowhere. We just have to be willing to listen. What really caused the year without a summer? What civilization ended in 1816, and who decided we shouldn't ask? Subscribe, this goes much deeper.